The Strait of Hormuz has a problem that aircraft carriers cannot solve. Everyone is watching the fighter jets, the cruise missiles, the destroyers with their radar arrays and vertical launch systems that attract the money, the headlines, and the defense budgets. And while global attention sits firmly on those headline assets, a different problem has been quietly building in that 21-mile stretch of water, where roughly a quarter of all the oil traded by sea passes through two shipping lanes, each one barely wider than a small town. The Strait of Hormuz does not look dramatic on a map. It is a narrow pinch point between Iran and Oman, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then to the wider world. Every single day in 2024, approximately 20 million barrels of oil moved through it, which represented around 20% of global petroleum consumption. Add liquefied natural gas from Qatar, known as LNG, and you are looking at 1/5 of the world's LNG trade passing through that same corridor. 84% of the crude oil flowing through Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian markets, and China, India, Japan, and South Korea together accounted for 69% of all those flows. When that passage closes, even briefly, the economic consequences do not stay in the Gulf. They land in Tokyo, Seoul, Mumbai, and Beijing within days. And here is the problem. The most effective way to close a 21-mile strait is not a missile strike or a naval battle. It is a mine. Naval mines are old technology, relatively cheap, and extremely difficult to detect, and they do not need to sink a single ship to work. The threat alone is enough. Insurers raise premiums, and at Lloyd's of London, war risk premiums on Gulf passages spiked sharply in 2019 and again in 2024. Shipping companies reroute, ports go quiet, and the global economy absorbs a wound from a weapon that may not have even been placed yet. By 2025 and into 2026, the forces specifically trained and equipped to find and neutralize those mines in the Gulf had almost entirely left the region. The United States Navy retired its last 4 dedicated Avenger-class minesweepers from Bahrain on the 25th of September 2025. 4 ships gone. The Royal Navy, which had maintained Hunt-class mine countermeasures vessels in the region for years, watched 2 of its own minesweepers collide in Bahrain Harbour in January 2024, and both were subsequently withdrawn. RFA Cardigan Bay, the support vessel that sustained those operations, also departed. By early 2026, HMS Middleton, the last Royal Navy mine countermeasures vessel in the Gulf, had been loaded onto a heavy lift ship and transported home. At the exact moment Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps officials were publicly declaring the strait closed to enemies, and military planners from 30 countries were convening in London to discuss what to do about it, the combined Western mine countermeasures presence in the Gulf had reached its lowest point since the 1980s. That is the problem. But to understand why the Royal Navy finds itself at the center of the solution, you need to go back considerably further. Britain's relationship with Bahrain and the Gulf is not a recent arrangement. The Royal Navy established a base in Bahrain in 1935, which means that connection predates Bahraini independence by 36 years. Britain's naval footprint in that harbor is older than the nations surrounding it, which is the kind of fact that tends to get lost in modern discussions about regional presence and legitimacy. When the Iran-Iraq War began generating serious threats to commercial shipping in 1980, the Royal Navy formalized what it had been doing informally for decades, and the Armilla Patrol launched in September of 1980 to maintain a continuous presence and protect British merchant vessels. That patrol became the institutional backbone of British Gulf operations across some genuinely difficult decades. During the 1982 Falklands War, the Royal New Zealand Navy quietly took over Armilla Patrol duties, so Royal Navy ships could be freed for operations in the South Atlantic. That detail rarely appears in accounts of the Falklands campaign, but it matters, because it shows that Britain's Gulf presence was considered important enough that even while fighting a war 8,000 miles away, the country arranged cover rather than simply abandoning the patrol. In 1987, the United States launched Operation Earnest Will, escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through Hormuz during what had by then become known as the Tanker War, the sustained campaign of attacks on oil tankers that had been grinding through the Gulf since 1984. On the very first convoy, the tanker Bridgeton struck an Iranian mine shortly after transiting the strait on the 24th of July. The most powerful navy in the world had just escorted a vessel into a minefield. It was not a great advertisement for the mission, but it demonstrated something that would matter for decades afterward. Mines in Hormuz were not a theoretical concern. They had been used before, and they would be considered again. Britain continued its Gulf presence through the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War, through the 2003 conflict, and in June 2011, the Armilla Patrol formally evolved into Operation Kipion, with an expanded remit covering the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal approaches, and counter-piracy operations across the Indian Ocean. The UK Naval Support Facility at Mina Salman port in Bahrain opened officially in April 2018, built at a cost of around £27 million and capable of accommodating approximately 500 Royal Navy personnel, with the Bahraini government contributing roughly 60% of the construction cost. For the first time in the modern era, Britain had a permanent bespoke base in the Gulf, a footprint that predated the East of Suez withdrawal of the late 1960s in institutional memory, even as it represented something genuinely new in bricks and infrastructure. But here's the thing. What Britain specialized in, almost uniquely among Western navies, was not destroyers or carrier strike capability. It was mine countermeasures. That specialization attracted very little attention or prestige for most of its existence, and it turned out to be the single capability that mattered most at exactly the worst possible moment. Because it is not just that mine countermeasures were underfunded and overlooked relative to more glamorous platforms. The United States Navy, the largest and most generously funded military force in history, found itself in 2025 genuinely unable to replicate what a handful of Royal Navy specialists were doing in the Gulf. The Americans retired their last dedicated minesweepers, and with them the MH-53E Sea Dragon helicopters that had formed the airborne mine countermeasures backbone since the tanker war era. The Royal Navy trained for this specific problem across several decades, and at the exact moment the threat became acute, the capability map looked nothing like the budget map. There is a dry irony in that worth sitting with. Countries collectively spent hundreds of billions of dollars on stealth aircraft, nuclear submarines, carrier groups, and ballistic missile defense systems, and then an adversary that did not need to win a naval battle, one that simply needed to make insurers nervous and shipping companies cautious, found that the most effective counter to all of that spending was a weapon older than most of the admirals overseeing the response, a weapon that costs a fraction of a single Tomahawk missile and requires no sophisticated delivery system whatsoever. The arithmetic of what the Royal Navy was actually doing in the Gulf before the withdrawals deserves close attention. HMS Montrose, the Type 23 frigate serving as Britain's forward deployed vessel in Bahrain from 2018, transited the Strait of Hormuz on 111 separate occasions and accompanied 132 merchant vessels through the passage. During that same deployment, Montrose seized over 16 tons of illegal narcotics across 10 separate operations, with a wholesale value on the UK market of at least £80 million. These were not symbolic patrols. They were working deployments producing measurable results on a consistent basis. In July 2019, Iran seized the UK-flagged oil tanker Stena Impero in retaliation for Gibraltar's detention of an Iranian vessel, and Montrose was close enough to observe the seizure, but not positioned to intervene. That single incident drove a significant escalation in escort responsibilities across the region. By November 2019, the European-led International Maritime Security Construct had launched operations, with Royal Navy vessels providing command and surveillance functions across the broader area. And then came the collision. In January 2024, HMS Chiddingfold and HMS Bangor, two of Britain's Hunt-class mine countermeasures vessels based in Bahrain, struck each other in the harbour. Both were eventually withdrawn. The 9th Mine Countermeasures Squadron effectively ceased to exist as a forward-deployed force, and by early 2026, HMS Middleton, the last of them, was aboard a heavy lift ship heading home. The timing could not have been more uncomfortable. A senior advisor to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps publicly declared the strait closed to enemies in March 2026, and that statement did not require confirmed mine laying to produce its intended effect. BIMCO and the International Maritime Organization had already warned that commercial confidence in the passage was unlikely to recover until credible mine clearance operations were visibly underway. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Strait of Hormuz falls under transit passage rights, meaning all states enjoy freedom of navigation through it, but that legal framework provides no practical mechanism to clear a seabed of mines. The threat functioned exactly as designed, producing economic disruption without requiring a single physical incident. The result was that in April 2026, military leaders from 30 countries gathered in London, and the meeting produced something concrete. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that Britain and France would co-lead a multinational mission, describing it in careful and specific terms as a strictly peaceful and defensive mission to reassure shipping and support mine clearance operations. Not a combat deployment, not an escalation, but a presence designed to restore confidence in a passage the global economy cannot function without. The Royal Navy's contribution centered on something that would have seemed obscure even to most defense observers 12 months earlier. RFA Lyme Bay departed Gibraltar carrying autonomous mine hunting systems and over 100 Royal Navy specialists from the Maritime Threat Exploitation Group. Commander Dan Harridge, commanding officer of that group, described the approach plainly. Personnel would employ advanced sensors operating through autonomy and artificial intelligence to detect threats below the surface. No traditional minesweeping vessels, no divers working the seabed, just unmanned surface vehicles and underwater drones conducting the detection work while specialists interpreted the data from the ship above. Now forget what the headline force posture looks like for a moment and consider what the contractors and specialists are quietly telling each other. The discussion around Hormuz has largely focused on which nation can project the most firepower and whether a carrier strike group in the region constitutes deterrence. A carrier group cannot sweep a minefield. A stealth jet cannot identify whether a specific patch of seabed contains a threat device. The thing standing between 20% of the world's oil supply and a potential closure was not a billion-dollar warship. It was a converted auxiliary vessel carrying specialist technicians and autonomous underwater robots, operating in a mission profile that most defense commentary had never bothered to mention. Britain's decades of investment in mine countermeasures, unglamorous and chronically underreported, produced the one capability that in early 2026, no other Western nation could simply deploy off the shelf. The Americans had retired theirs, including those MH-53E Sea Dragon platforms. The French held some capacity but not the depth of specialization, and a mission announced jointly by two European powers to protect a choke point through which the majority of flows went to Asian economies was going to be executed primarily by equipment that most audiences had never heard mentioned in a defense briefing. The bypass pipelines exist, and it is worth acknowledging. Saudi Arabia and the UAE between them hold roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of pipeline capacity that could route crude oil around the strait entirely. But 20 million barrels per day moved through Hormuz in 2024, which means bypass capacity covers at most a quarter of normal flows, even under the most optimistic operating assumptions. That arithmetic does not resolve the problem. It softens the edges slightly, while the actual solution, mine clearance and the restoration of commercial confidence, gets worked out by specialists with autonomous underwater systems in a sea lane the world depends on every single day. And that is where things stand as of early 2026. Not resolved, not escalating into open confrontation, but sitting in the uncomfortable middle ground where the threat remains real enough to move insurance markets and disrupt shipping schedules without producing the kind of visible incident that forces a faster response. The mission is underway, the capability is deployed, and the question of whether it will be enough remains genuinely open. The Royal Navy has been working that passage since 1980, which is 46 years of continuous presence in a region most people only notice when something goes wrong. For most of that time, the mine countermeasure specialists aboard those slow, unglamorous hunt-class vessels attracted no headlines and very little budget, and they trained anyway. Right now, with the Americans gone and the commercial shipping industry watching nervously, that training is the thing the world is quietly relying on. If the gap between the capabilities Western navies publicize and the ones that actually end up mattering is a subject that interests you, this channel covers exactly that territory. The Lyme Bay mission is still developing, and when the outcomes become clear, that story will be covered here. The Strait of Hormuz does not make the news on quiet days. 20 million barrels pass through it unnoticed while attention sits elsewhere. On those quiet days, the specialists aboard those vessels are still out there, running their systems, logging their data, and doing work that nobody watches until the moment the world suddenly needs it done.